Um, right, hi everyone. Yeah, as I said before, thanks for giving up all your previous engagements to come to the talk. Loads of apologies. Before I start, I'm going to have to be whiz through it really quickly. There'll be a couple of break points, but if I'm going too quickly, just say at the break point, the first break point, I've put too much material in this presentation really, because I need to do a bit of background before I can talk about what's going on the Hendred Estate. I need to put it all in context. So the first section's about industrial agriculture and what's gone wrong with our food system. I make quite a few sweeping generalizations, and I'm sweeping over a lot of topics. A lot of these slides, we could spend a week debating them, whereas I'm going to do them in about 20 seconds. So first, apologies for my schoolboy attempt at alliteration with the title. I was starting to think about what the issues were, and it's interesting, Sean saying about staying profitable, hence staying solvent is one of our major issues. Right, but basically we're trying to sort of keep lots of balls in the air at once. First of all, I've got to talk about a few things before I start, and also the talk might seem quite random to start with, I'm afraid, but hopefully it'll all start to come together, because I've got to talk about a lot of interrelating concepts, and it's quite hard to put it in a structure. I'll be talking quite a lot about certain things, like diversity is a big theme running through, and I'll be talking about industrial agriculture quite a lot. But what is industrial agriculture? If you think about farming for thousands and thousands of years, it was sort of a pretty small scale, labor intensive, complex crop rotations, mixed farms with livestock, low input, low output. It's basically organic farming. But since the Second World War, the push for cheap and abundant food and the advent of mechanization, the scientific advancements, artificial fertilizers, crop protection chemicals, farms got bigger, simpler, more specialized. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that soil was a useful growth medium, and it got reverted to just being a medium for standing the crop up in, while we gave the crop everything it needed with fossil fuel based inputs. And for a while it worked, and it was all fantastic. It's all fairly sterile. I mean, this slide here sort of is how I sort of visualize industrial agriculture. It's all very sterile and very mechanized and very fossil fuel based. But it was fantastic for a while. It gave us lots of cheap food, and we didn't realize that a lot of the chemicals were harmful to the environment at the time. So that's industrial agriculture. Is it possible to farm in harmony with nature? I don't think it is. I mean, it's a phrase that lots of people use. I think as soon as you take a unit area of land and say, I want to grow food on this, you're managing that bit of land, and so you're displacing nature to an extent. And so it's how we deal with that, really. Farming to an extent is going to put nature through the mincer, and it's how we can do it with the sort of least negative effects that we can. And there's a classic debate which has been raging for a long time. It's the land sharing versus sparing debate. Do you have areas that are effectively rewilded, like the Hendred Estate, and that are complete wildlife havens as islands and intensive farming all around them? Or do you have a low level of environmentally friendly farming across the whole landscape? And it's a debate that rages on, and there's pros and cons for both approaches. But basically the take-home message is some negative effects are inevitable on nature unless we're just going to rewild the whole country and starve. Here's another little analogy, which I'll talk about the factory premises quite a lot. It's a little analogy that I made up, which I use quite a lot, which I think is really helpful. If you think about a car manufacturer like BMW, their source of profit is their production line, producing the minis and selling at a profit. But obviously their production line's housed in factory premises, so some of the profits diverted to maintain the factory premises. And if the factory premises weren't looked after, the whole business would effectively collapse. The problem with industrial agriculture over the years is it's neglected to maintain the factory premises. It's, if you consider that the natural ecosystem that we're working in is the factory premises, industrial agriculture is really concentrated on just producing food from the fields, and just sort of ignored the nature going on around to an extent. And so we're reaching a point where the sort of metaphorical factory roof is in danger of collapsing and impinging on the ability of the production line to work. And it's not because farmers have done this deliberately. Farmers have been chasing profit. Well, not necessarily chasing profit, trying to stay in business. And it's also, we weren't really taught to farm in harmony with nature. If you think about all the farmers my age that are sort of in control of UK agriculture, farmers between the age of about 45 and 65, we were all educated at ag colleges in the 70s and 80s and early 90s. And no one ever mentioned the environment. No one ever mentioned biodiversity. It was all about how to maximize output, which chemical to use, which fertilizer to use. And I think the other thing is, I think farmers and the general public as well, apart from a few enlightened people, thought that nature had an infinite capacity to be abused, a bit like the seas and the atmosphere that we're now finding out, and that we could just keep abusing nature and it had an infinite capacity to absorb the abuse. But it's becoming apparent that it hasn't. So when I talk about the factory premises, I'm talking about the environment that we're working in. So effectively, we've been putting it through nature through the mincer and operating our industrial ag systems over the last 40 or 50 years. Sorry, I've got a problem on my computer, that's it. Just a few issues here with farming and why we've had to resort to industrial agriculture. Lack of profitability is a real problem. I dug up an old picture of me from 1978 planting wheat. That tractor and drill value was about £600, and the wheat we were selling for about £100 a tonne. Roll on to 2015, the drilling rig cost £209,000. We were selling wheat for about £114 a tonne, and that's not inflation adjusted. So basically our costs have gone up massively. Labour costs, my dad was paying me about £15 a week, whereas my guys are on about £15 an hour when they're sitting in a tractor. So there's a real squeeze. Costs have gone up massively, but our output hasn't really gone up in real terms in value. Well, it's gone down in real terms. That one, you don't really need to look at the figures much there, other than over the last 25 years, seed sprays and fertilizers gone up over 200%. The same picture. The other problem we've got is you nasty consumers out there aren't spending very much on food. About 50 years ago, you were spending about 30% of your disposable income on food. Now you're spending about 15% on food. So obviously everyone's a bit, most people are better off, but that extra money you're spending on holidays, flashier cars, widescreen TVs, and you want cheap food. So we have to try and produce it. Here's one which just is a nice little slide. It's a bit out of date, 2014 to 2015, but it shows you the general picture. If you look at those bars, different types of farming and the income and the profit derived from different bits of the business. The red is from the pure agriculture. Blue is from any diversification like glamping sites or farm shops or whatever. The green from agri-environment payments, and the purple from SPS, which is a single farm payment. So that's the subsidy that we get from the taxpayer to effectively keep us in business. And it's really quite interesting, that slide. It really shows, it shows quite a lot. And I need to get you to remember a few things off this slide for later in the talk. Hendred is effectively on the left-hand bar, cereal. That's probably the closest bar that describes us. So effectively, we're not really making much money out of our farming. It's all from the subsidies. The interesting ones are, look at the dairy, the specialist pig, and the specialist poultry. We're going to come back to those when we talk about intensive farming. They're all making money without subsidy. The other interesting one is horticulture. In those years, they were showing a profit, but no, they don't get very much subsidy because subsidies are based on the size of the business. Traditionally, for the last 30 odd years, it's all changing now. And horticultural business obviously are quite small, so they're not getting much government money. They're sort of operating in the real world more than all the other agricultural sectors. And they're the most important, but they're getting the least subsidy. Well, they're one of the most important, but the main one is to look at that dairy, pig and poultry, how they can make profit without subsidies, and how a lot of the other sectors don't really make any money unless you nice taxpayers subsidise us all. So don't worry about the text on this. It's just to really remind me what to talk about and just to illustrate the point. Industrial agriculture worked for 40 or 50 years, and then the wheels have started to drop off. I suppose a bit like diesel cars. Everybody thought diesel cars were fantastic until they realised they weren't fantastic. And a bit like smoking, when I was a kid, you know, everybody wanted to be like the Marlboro Man and pull loads of girls and look really cool smoking. Then we realised it's horrific. This is what happened with the chemicals that we're using. They all seem fantastic at the start. And then over time, we've realised that there's a lot of environmental pollution going on. So basically farming is, industrial agriculture's sort of polluting the environment. The other problem is, as any O-level biology student would be able to tell you, is if you keep using chemicals and things against natural enemies like pests and diseases, they'll evolve resistance to them. So all these nasty environmental harming chemicals we're using, everything's getting resistant to them now as well. So they're not working anymore. Nature's fighting back. And that's really quite a problem with industrial agriculture. A, the products are fossil fuel based, so they're finite resources. B, they're environmentally damaging. And C, they don't work. You can see why the wheels are dropping off industrial ag. We've got problems with perceived, we could talk all night about this, so I'm just going to skip over this. But anyway, the whole meat eating debate, and should people be eating meat or should they be trying to save the planet and all become vegetarians? We haven't got time to go into that, but that's impinging on what farmers do, because a lot of farmers are producing a lot of meat, which a lot of people are saying we shouldn't be eating anymore. I want to spend a little bit of time on this, intensive livestock versus extensive livestock. This is the real baddie in my mind. Those intensive poultry units, intensive beef unit, intensive pig unit down the bottom of the slide there, they shouldn't exist. They blatantly shouldn't exist. Interestingly, they're the sectors that are making money. If you remember back to the bar chart, because they've had to specialize their business and make it so intensive that their cost of production is so low they can make a profit and produce cheap food to the supermarket marketing model. They're welfare unfriendly, obviously, compared to the nice stock grazing the pasture on the top slides. It's climate unfriendly. We're basically feeding them produce that's been produced by industrial agriculture crop systems that are producing carbon unfriendly grains, which are then fed to the intensive livestock units. Whereas if you imagine the cattle and the sheep and the hens grazing the grass has been sequestering carbon like mad, and the implications from the climate aren't half as bad. There's a big problem with promoting antibiotic resistance. So in 5, 10, 15 years time, none of us will be able to have hip replacements because there'll be no antibiotics that will work against the superbugs, because farmers have had to, in these intensive units, with the low levels of disease, have had to feed antibiotics in the feed to try and keep the animals growing and producing. So that's a big problem. It just goes on and on and on. And the latest one is obviously the increased risk of human pandemics. If you think of a HN51 virus or some piggy or poultry virus that might mutate to a human virus, if that's afflicted that hen grazing the pasture in that top left slide, by the time that hen's been into contact with another hen, the hen's probably dead and the virus has died with it. But these hens in the bottom left there, I mean, the evolutionary pressure on these viruses is just absolutely immense, because even the very lethal viruses, which in an extensive environment aren't very transmittable because they've killed the host before they've transmitted to something else, in the intensive units, they're just beak to beak transmission. And the pressure on the virus is mutating, immense and evolving. So they shouldn't exist. But unfortunately, consumers want cheap food, and people want to buy cheap chicken on the supermarket shelf, and they want to buy cheap bacon. We could talk all night about this, but I need to whiz through it. We've got potentially food-related health problems. We've got, again, we can't spend long on this slide, but pesticide residues in food. And also, this is interesting, this dirt poor have fruits and vegetables become less nutritious. As we've pushed the yields of crops with our industrial ag systems and put lots of fertilizer and chemicals on, it is fairly scientifically proven that we're creating a lot of biomass, but there's less nutrition concentrated in the biomass. Yeah, I mean, this is just, what the hell have we done to our food system? I mean, that's a view into a supermarket. That's highly processed, highly packaged, horrendous food miles, basically full of palm oil, corn syrup, salt, when food used to look like that. And this is a sort of, this slide here is how traditionally before the supermarkets, you know, these small scale horticultural enterprises feeding into local markets, no packaging, less pesticide residues, more nutritious, low carbon miles. But the trouble is the supermarket model has forced a lot of small local businesses out of business. And so everything's multinational, global, long supply chains. I'm going to stop there. I know 2 more slides quickly on this. Self-sufficiency, again, that's really interesting, because I know a lot of our self-sufficiency issues are because we want to eat more exotic things. But even if you look on the top right there, we import about 35% of our veg and about 90% of our fruit, even 80% of our apples, which we can grow in this country, imported. Again, it's the way the food system has been, as this supermarket model, and the way the food has to go down the food chain to the consumer. It really doesn't, you know, Grove Farms used to be a big apple producer. There used to be lots of little apple orchards everywhere around here, but it just doesn't work anymore. Soil, here's one. Sorry, there are about 2 more slides in this section, then we'll stop for questions. Soil, it's not really very important, is it? But it is. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just show you something. Hang on a sec. Oh, that's good. I'm back with you. Hopefully you can see this. Apologies to anyone who has seen this before. This is a bit of an analogy to how much soil we've got to work with. There's our planet, an apple. Let me start cutting it up. I've just taken away 3/4 of it because that's sea and 1/4 of it's land. I'm going to cut that in half. I've just taken away half of the land because that's real inhospitable areas like the poles, the high Himalayas that we can't live in or do anything with. That leaves half of a quarter, whatever that is, of the surface area of the planet. 3/4 of that is either deserts, fairly inhospitable for growing food, or it's cities or roads. We can't grow food on it. We can only grow food on 1/4 of that segment, which leaves us a little bit of a segment. And then obviously we can only grow food on the topsoil. So I'll peel that segment, which I don't know how effective this is on Zoom, but that was our planet that we're living on, 7 billion people. And we've got the skin on a 32nd of the planet to grow food on, and it's diminishing. Right, I'll share the screen again if I can. Are we back? Yeah. So with that 32nd of the planet, that's 3% of the planet's surface, and it's disappearing. There, I'll explain a bit later on in the talk why it's disappearing and how it's disappearing. But here's a couple of newspaper articles from recently. Fertility, that's the Independent at the top there. Fertility of world soil reaching a peak that will threaten food supply, scientists warn. There's a Telegraph from about 2016, 2015. Britain facing food crisis as well. Soil vanishes in 60 years. So it's all doom and gloom. It's horrendous. It's vanishing in 2 ways, really. It's vanishing physically, water erosion and wind erosion. That slide on that picture on the right is the UK taken from a satellite in 2012 after that really wet winter. You can see all the brown soil in the seas, particularly in the Bristol Channel and different places around the Thames Estuary, the Wash. That's basically fantastic topsoil that we haven't got much of, washed into the sea. Also, it's degrading in ways that are much more subtle, that we can't really see. The quality of the soil is degrading. By the quality, I really mean the carbon stocks. I'll talk about this more later. And the soil biology. The soil biology is being degraded and killed out, and the carbon stocks are depleting. think of the carbon stocks like a deposit account. It's, say you have £1 million in a deposit account and you take out £100,000 a year. For the first 10 years, you won't really notice anything is wrong. And then in year 11, you've suddenly got a problem. You're sleeping on the street in a cardboard box because you've run out of money. Organic matter depletion is a bit like that. We're not really noticing it happening. Luckily, it's reversible. Some interesting things there. Effectively, soil's a non-renewable resource. I always think it's quite nifty because you take the S off and you get oil. It's very like oil. It can be made again, but it takes thousands of years, in the same way that oil can be remade. We're using it faster than it's being remade. So it's effectively non-renewable. You should all think about soil in the same way as you think about oil. And that gives you peak soil as a concept unless we do something about it. And the other interesting thing is, someone mentioned to me once about, if you had an alien planet observing us over millennia and they might be describing us to their other alien friends, those humans, how do you describe them? Well, from our observation, they're a desert-making species. I'll talk about those things about why reduced organic matter levels are bad later on. So that's the end of the first depressing section. It's all going to get brilliant after this. I've taken you down the roller coaster to the pits of despair, and you can ask some questions now, and then I'll explain to you why it's all hunky-dory and what we're trying to do about it at Hendred. So that slide there just sort of sums up a few of the things, but it's all I had to set the scene because what we do on the farm, it's all interrelated. We're not just producing food and forgetting about it. It all works backwards from what you consumers are buying and eating, and how you perceive all the issues with animal welfare and climate change and everything else. We're all in together, and the food system is very much a group activity. Sarah, shall I stop screen sharing for a minute and hand over to you for a sec?
Yeah, I think that'd be great. So this is one of our question break points. So do put your questions in the chat, or you can also try the raised hand function and I can try and spot you in the participants list as well. So I can see a question. There's a few comments in the chat, but I can see one question from Lynn Mason. Is hydroponics a solution?
Yeah, hydroponics fits in with the land sharing versus land sparing debate. Obviously, I didn't really go into that, but obviously you've got all the alternatives of rewild. You could have very intensive farming. You could have rewilding in areas. You could have very intensive sort of hydroponic systems, these systems underground in London with LED lights. So you could massively intensify the food system in small areas and leave aside big areas for nature. Or like I say, you do it all extensively, and it's a whole range in between the two extremes. It's a spectrum, really, the land sharing versus land sparing. It's a bit like the autism spectrum. You could go to extremely to one end or extremely to the other end, or anywhere in between.
Thank you. And we've got another question about the estate from Phil. Are you an arable farm?
Yeah, mainly arable. You'll see all about the estate in a minute.
Okay, so we're coming to that. I also had a question myself, which was, can you tell yet what kind of impact the changes in the subsidy systems that the UK will sort of implement now we've left the EU will have?
Yeah, I'll talk about a bit about that at the end, just so everybody knows what Sarah's talking about. Basically, what I've been talking about is from now going backwards 40 or 50 years, but it's all changing. It's not all too depressing, because this is what used to happen, and industrial agriculture is basically pretty dead and buried, hopefully, because the new focus is all on environment and looking after the environment, still producing food, but thinking about it much more holistically. And government payments, these subsidies that I was talking about, the purple bit on the bar that's keeping us all in business, they're all disappearing to nothing over 7 years, and we're going to get more environmental payments. I'll talk about a bit about that at the end, but that's the change that's happening at the moment. We're at the cusp of change at the moment.
And that sort of leads on a bit, or links to a question from Charles. How much of this is being taught in agricultural colleges now?
I don't know because I'm not in ag college. But yeah, no, I do get Reading University students round, and they do understand what you mean when you talk about biodiversity in the environment now. Whereas back in the mid 80s, you would have got booted out of college if you mentioned biodiversity, for not taking agriculture seriously. So yeah, it is all changing, but the thing is, it needs to change a bit faster. You have to remember that there's old fogies like me still in charge of agriculture for another 10 years till we've all retired or dead. And, you know, a lot can still go wrong in 10 years. The change, it's like climate change and everything else. The change really needed to happen yesterday, not in 5 years' time. There's an urgency to make the change happen quickly. So the change is happening, but whether it's quick enough, I should romp on really because we have more questions at the end. I've still got quite a lot to get through. Can I just check that I'm not going too quickly and I'm not being too incoherent, because I'm really having to race through this. Is it okay? Yeah, okay. I'll keep going then, shall I?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. We've got a few more questions, but I'll note them down and we'll come back to those.
Because I'll see how the time's going. I'll go as quick as I can over the next bit, and then we can have a longer break on after the next third.
Yeah, and questions at the end, and
questions at the end, yeah.
And some of these questions might get answered.
Yeah, hopefully.
Anyway.
Okay, cool. I'll share the screen again.
Thanks.
Right, that was a depressing bit. Now we're on to the good, funky bit. We're trying to be part of the solution. Right. I've just got to try and, it's quite hard. Again, we could have a week-long course on this slide. I've just got to talk to you about a couple of things to set the scene again as to why this whole section is about soil health, which is something we're really into on the Hendred Estate. And so this is about space for wildlife, but it's about space for the wildlife under your feet that a lot of people might not be as au fait with and as aware of as they should be. So it's space for wildlife that you can't really see. So there's an immense soil ecosystem under our feet. And if you looked at a healthy soil, if you took a teaspoonful, to put it in context, of healthy soil, which was nice and biologically active, there might be up to 7 billion microorganisms, the same as the number of people on the planet, in that teaspoonful of soil. Conversely, on a damaged soil that had received lots of chemicals, for example, an intensive potato grower in the fens, there could be 0 microorganisms and 0 soil biology. It might just be a physical medium, but it's supposed to be a functioning ecosystem. It's so complex. So it's full of all these fungi, bacteria, springtails, protozoa, worms, etc., etc. And they're all existing in this massively complex ecosystem. It's so complex, it's hard to take things out of the ecosystem and experiment with them in the lab. Scientists know more about the surface of Mars than they do about the soil system, because one of the things they're trying to do is they're trying to find new antibiotics to try and cope with these resistant things that our antibiotics can't, the antibiotic resistant infections that our antibiotics don't work on anymore. And the answer's in the soil, and they will find all the new antibiotics from the soil. But when they take things out of the soil to try and put them on a petri dish, agar jelly, to work on them, they die basically. The system's so complex, they can't exist out of the soil system. So it's really hard to do research on the soil. So there's, and also the other thing with the soil is there's massive potential to sequester carbon. Basically, it's a big carbon sponge, because the soil ecosystem, I see it as like the engine of the planet, and carbon's a fuel to keep the engine running. So what we need to do is think about traditional farming. In traditional farming, the crop is the thing. So farmers, you know, that is the thing that the farmer's farming. But I turn it on its head, and the soil ecosystem is the thing for me, and the crop is a byproduct. So it's a bit of a fairy story. I sort of tell myself I'm a bit like a method actor. I try and sort of get myself in role for what I'm doing. So I consider myself a photosynthesis facilitator, and I consider myself a slave for the soil system. So I imagine this scenario where the soil ecosystem is intelligent, and it needs food, and it can see the sunshine, and it can see the carbon in the atmosphere. And so it's worked out if it can evolve these slaves called plants to grow in it and harness these things out the atmosphere and turn them into food, the crop can be a slave for the soil ecosystem. And likewise, it's harnessed me as a slave to tend the crops. So I'm a slave to the soil system, and I'm tending the crops, making them nice, big photosynthesizing crops. And in exchange, they give me the grains for my hard toil. So it sounds a bit weird and naive and autistic, but it's just a different way of thinking. And interestingly, the end result is, because I'm focused on the soil ecosystem and soil health, I get high yields of crops. So by actually not focusing on a high yield of crop, I get a high yield of crop, but it's almost a byproduct. That was a bit waffly, because just going on, not wanting to give you an O-level biology lesson, but just to make the point about photosynthesis. These crops that are plants that are photosynthesizing, they only need some of the products of photosynthesis for growth, and they have spare products of photosynthesis that they don't need. Up to about 20 to 40% of the products of photosynthesis are spare, and so they exude them out in their root systems into the soil as liquid carbon, organic acids. So it's basically food for the soil ecosystem, and that's why we talk about crops and soils sequestering carbon. And it is an in-out process, the carbon. So if you think about it, obviously during the daylight hours, crops are sequestering carbon. Then at nighttime, they're respiring, so some carbon's going out. And then they're sequestering carbon in their root systems and in the soil. And then farmers go along and cultivate, which reoxidizes it, and it turns back into carbon dioxide. So conventional agriculture is a bit like the hokey cokey. You sort of in, out, shake the soil system all about, and the carbon's in and out. So what we're trying to do is have a net gain of carbon into the soil. So we're taking soil out of the atmosphere and we're feeding the soil ecosystem. It's a complete win-win. So, sorry, that was a bit long-winded and waffly. I'll speed up now. This is another way of looking at it. That's just another way of looking at the same thing. So you've got the plants are obviously got structural carbon in their straw and in their grains. They've got structural carbon in their root systems as they're growing, and they're exudating this yummy liquid carbon for the soil community to snack on all the time. And this is a problem with traditional farming. With traditional farming, farmers go along after harvest. They might bale and cart the straw off, which is a nice source of carbon for the soil. I give it back. And they might plough or cultivate the soil, which lets oxygen in. And then all that nicely sequestered carbon just floats back out into the atmosphere. So that's a whole thing. All this stuff you hear about soil is the answer to, and carbon sequestration is the answer to climate change. It can be, but we just have to think about how we farm the soil. Right, that was a bit waffly. Here's just a couple of, these are the sort of things that excite me. It's like the symbiotic relationships that go on. Mycorrhizal fungi, they're just amazing things. And they're a fungus that lives in a symbiotic relationship on the plant root. So that's a plant root, but all those little hyphae going off are mycorrhizal fungi, and it increases the root surface area by up to 1,000 times. And the plant is feeding the fungi carbon, and the fungi is feeding the plant water and hard to get nutrients like phosphate. So it's a complete win-win deal. They're both feeding each other. And it's very easy with modern agriculture, industrial agriculture, particularly with cultivations, to destroy the mycorrhizal fungi physically and chemically by the chemicals we put on and the physical damage that we do. If you think about it, all these, and even earthworms, they've all got their, like the fungi and the earthworms, they've got their physical houses, if you like, in the soil. And what farmers do traditionally every summer after harvest is plough and cultivate. Well, that's the same as someone coming along and dropping a bomb on your house every year, reducing it to rubble. You spend a whole year building it back up, and then 12 months later, they come and drop a bomb on it again. This is what's happening physically in the soil ecosystem with cultivations. Nature doesn't have ploughs and cultivators. The soil ecosystem is supposed to be undisturbed, because then the worms, particularly this, don't worry too much about the text, but particularly these deep burrowing, that nice vertical burrow there, the deep burrowing earthworms, you can see a nice little heap of litter on the surface. They're dragging all the surface residues, bringing them down into the soil, chewing them up. Their poo then is very highly concentrated nutrients that the plant roots can feed on, and all the other soil lower down the food chain, soil microorganisms can feed on. And so it's a fantastic system. And these drainage channels are really good for draining water through the soil. They're just fantastic. But with cultivations, we destroy them all. So there's all this stuff going on in the soil, and industrial agriculture sort of ignores it. Right. I won't spend long on that, but this is how I do my farming to get a healthy soil. So it's about structure and it's about organic matter. Just looking at the left-hand side, we need a good structure. We need air and water in the soil, and we don't want to compact it. So we want to let the plant roots go down into the soil. And like I said before, we don't want to cultivate it, because cultivation destroys the homes of the soil life, and it also lets the carbon back out. And we only want to work it when it's dry, because we damage it too much. And this is where controlled traffic, which I'll talk about later, fits in with that structure side. And on the right hand side, again, organic matter I've spoken about. We want to grow high yielding crops to maximize carbon sequestration. And also we want to keep the soil covered with crops all the time, because we want to feed, we want those snacks, that liquid carbon snack, to be going in all the time. We want to return the crop residues, because that's carbon that the soil system wants, and they want me to give it back to them. Forget about that next one for a minute, minimizing synthetic N use. I will talk about that briefly, but synthetic N sort of burns up soil organic carbon. And synthetic N is a big thing that drives industrial agriculture, lots of synthetic N. And also, as I said before, right at the bottom, we don't want to oxidize sequestered carbon by excessive cultivations. And again, that's where our controlled traffic fits in. Right, pretty pictures now. So really what I'm doing now is working down that right-hand side there, and the left-hand side, actually. I'm working through this slide in pretty pictures now, what we're doing on the estate. So, sorry, take a breath. I spoke about cover cropping and keeping the soil covered. So traditionally, people, new listeners out there might have, listeners, it sounds like I'm on TV. You listeners might have noticed over the years that you see less brown soil over the winter. Traditionally, sort of particularly 10, 15, 20 years ago, farmland would all be brown over the winter. We'd harvest our crops. It would either be bare stubble like the main picture, or brown like the inset. And we just leave it over winter ready for spring cropping. But you've got no photosynthesizing plants. I'm starving my soil system. So what we do now is grow cover crops before spring crops, no bare soil. And again, multi-species cover crops. So we want diversity. Diversity is something I spoke about at the start, and I'll talk more and more about diversity now as we go through. So everything's about diversity, not simplicity. So they're multi-species cover crops. Got lots of things in. They've got vetches in and red clover and things that are pulses. They're basically utilizing the nitrogen in the air. So I talked about minimizing synthetic N use. But if you think about the air is 72% nitrogen. So if we can use legumes, they can take nitrogen out of the air and put it into the soil to feed the crops. So we're trying to utilize legumes in the cover crops. And again, this is a slide. This just shows you the point about diversity. That's just a slide of prairie grasses, but it just in America, but it illustrates the point nicely. If you've got a diversity of species, you've got lots of different root systems, some shallow, some deep. And also when I spoke about soil biology and mycorrhizal fungi earlier on, different mycorrhizal fungi are attracted to different plants. So if you have a diversity of plant systems, you have a diversity of below ground ecology as well. So it's all about plant diversity. Right, pretty pictures again. And remember on that other slide, I spoke about that one there. I spoke about returning crop residues to the soil. So what we try and do, instead of baling our straw, we chop the straw. So that's the combine chopping the straw. That's a big load of straw. And then we're planting the next crop into that straw, which again, our ability to do this has been, the science and technology has helped us here, because 15 years ago, the equipment wouldn't have been able to cope with straw loads like this, because they would have got blocked. And so traditionally everybody would have either baled the straw off or ploughed it under and turned the field brown, and then planted the next crop. But we want to leave the straw on the surface, because for various reasons, we want to leave it there for lots of reasons. It's basically, so remember the picture of the earthworm. So the earthworms now are coming up and they're grabbing all the straw that we've left and they're dragging it down into the soil. So we don't need to plough it and cultivate it to mix it in, because nature does it for us. We've got all this straw left on the surface, as you can see in the main picture, whereas traditionally in the inset, that's a more traditional drilling situation where a farmer's ploughed and cultivated. Okay, just think about the wet winters we've been getting, and also the much heavier rainfall. October last year, we had 199 mils of rain, which was the wettest single month I've had in 28 years of being here and recording rainfall. That with climate change, the times of the year are getting wetter and the rainfall events are getting heavier. Imagine the rainfall event, a big heavy rainfall event, if that field was on a slope in the inset. Remember the picture about England in 2012 with all the soil washed into the sea. Imagine if that was a field on a slope by a river or sea. That soil is just loose and crumbly. The rain hits it, it just washes off. Whereas my fields, there's something in the way to slow down the raindrops. Imagine the raindrops hitting that straw and then they percolate through slowly. So I've reduced the impact damage from the rain. What else about that? So yeah, and then gradually over the year, then my trash managers, instead of using a plough, I'll let my trash managers do it. So all my lovely worms pop up. And remember that little picture of the worm there with his midden above his hole. Basically the worms, once you got your eye on, it's really easy to see in the fields. In both those shots, all those little bits of trash are all worm middens, that basically the worms popped his head up and dragged the surrounding residue and make a little pyramid above their wormhole, and then they just pop up occasionally, drag a bit more down, and the trash gradually disappears into the soil. Right, that's returning residues. Just a very quick bit about synthetic N. We come into another break point quickly then. I think I've only got about 3 or 4 more slides. Again, I could spend about 3 weeks explaining this slide. Let me try and do it simply if I can. So we use a lot of synthetic N in industrial agriculture. So the chemists came up with nice ways of making N with the Haber-Bosch process, which is incredibly environmentally unfriendly. And then we get this fertilizer in our simple industrial ag systems and we spread loads of it on our fields. And if you think about the soil system, without getting too complicated, there's a carbon nitrogen ratio in the soil system. It's about 10:1 carbon to nitrogen. So if you imagine there's loads of soil bugs under the soil surface and you put loads of nitrogen into the system, that upsets the CN ratio. And so the CN ratio in the soil system is too much in favor of nitrogen. So the bugs have got to find carbon from somewhere to equalize the ratio. And so what they do is they start eating soil organic matter to try and get at the carbon. And when they're eating soil organic matter, they're respiring CO2 out of their mouths. And so that's going up into the atmosphere. So when soil organic matter is getting eaten by the soil bugs, CO2 is frittering out the system. And we want some soil organic matter to be eaten by the bugs because it makes nutrients available, but we don't want a lot of it to be eaten by the bugs. And excessive use of synthetic N has burnt too much organic matter effectively out of the system, like that right-hand black arrow. And that was one of the reasons in my earlier slides I was saying about how soil organic matter reduces. You've also got loads of other issues on the left with nitrogen. You've got ammonia emissions. We're way off meeting our European targets, although we're not in Europe anymore. So presumably we haven't got the targets anymore, but we did have European targets for ammonia emissions in the atmosphere, and the UK was no way going to meet them. A lot of the ammonia emissions are coming from intensive livestock units. Going back to the intensive livestock slide, they have to have those intensive pig units and poultry units. They've got lots of intensive muck going into big lagoons and heaps, which isn't very environmentally friendly, and there's lots of ammonia emissions going off. But the same happens with nitrogen fertilizer. Also nitrous oxide, which is about 273 times more warming than a molecule of CO2. So its effect on climate change is more harmful. And also nitrate leaching into watercourses. It takes about 50 years for nitrates to leach through into groundwater. So even if UK ag stopped using synthetic nitrogen overnight, nitrate levels in water would still keep going up for about 50 years. So, and also again, just in the middle there, sorry, just labouring the point because nitrogen is quite bad. High synthetic N levels, it's the nitrogen is like the oil that lubricates the wheels of industrial agriculture because it drives crop growth. And so you put loads of nitrogen on, you get loads of lush crop growth. And again, it takes too long to explain it in detail, but it causes the plants to be attractive to pests and diseases more because they grow in a different way. They grow too quickly and the cell structure is wrong compared to a naturally slow growing plant. So it's a vicious spiral of using high N levels. That industrial ag picture I showed you at the start of the crop standing up in the scaffolding with us putting loads of inputs on, because we're putting loads of N on, we have to put loads more of the inputs on, and it just, the whole thing is just an accelerating spiral of inputs on inputs. So the only take-home message you need to really take from that is nitrogen, synthetic nitrogen is bad in excess, but it's good up to a point because it promotes high biomass growth, which promotes photosynthesis. So I know Lucy's listening, so I'm going to get in trouble. Sorry, let me go back. I'm going to get in trouble with Helen. But in some ways, organic farmers aren't as good as sequestering carbon into the soil in some ways as commercial farmers because their crop yields are much lower. And so that photosynthesis exudates going into the soil that I was talking about are much lower in organic systems because the crops don't grow as well because they're not getting so much fertilizer. But obviously organic systems are better in other ways. But from the pure point of carbon sequestration, a high yielding fertilized crop is better. So commercial farmers kind of hold their heads up a little bit when they're in the company of organic farmers. Sorry, Lucy. Right. Forget about this slide. This is just showing how on the farm we're trying to reduce our use of N fertilizer. And it's through other things like using legumes that you'll see later on, but it's also about using our fertilizer efficiently with modern technology up in that top left, the type of fertilizer we use, the basic things like testing our sprayer every time we go out to check it's working accurately. Not a lot of farmers do that. And that bottom left one, little and often N applications, we do lots of little applications instead of big dollops of N. So if you like, the soil biology and the crop are fighting for it. So if the soil biology and the crop are fighting for the little dollop of N, you don't get so many of these ammonia emissions, nitrous oxide emissions, nitrate leaching, because they're all fighting for it, this little small pot of N, rather than putting it onto excess. So that's that. Now I'm going to talk about controlled traffic. So I'm going to talk, we're nearly done this section, bear with me. I'm talking about how controlled traffic sits into our soil health system, and then we'll stop for a break. The last section's really quick then. Controlled traffic basically is all about modern machinery is blooming heavy. I don't know where those arrows came from. Modern machinery is blooming heavy, 20 to 30 ton, whereas that old tractor of about 50 years ago was only about 2 ton. Which one would you rather drive over a fragile bridge? Maybe not the new bridge at Gingebrook, but maybe the old bridge might be a problem. So again, with this modern technology and big tractors and industrial agriculture, we're squeezing and compacting the soil. So what we used to do, and what a lot of farmers still do, is we used to drive about all over the place with different width implements, and we used to compact about 80% of the soil surface. So then to get the compaction out, we had to go and put cultivators in to try and loosen it back up. And again, that was letting carbon out, and it was physically destroying the domestic properties of the soil organisms. What we do now with very high accuracy satellite guidance, accurate to within 2 centimeters, everything works on a 10-meter width multiple of, and everybody drives down the same lines. And it means instead of trafficking 80% of the soil surface, we're trafficking 20% of the soil surface. So it's a bit like no-dig gardening. We've turned our soil trafficking on its head. And this is our neighbour, who shall remain nameless, not too far away. This is what it looks like in the field. That's non-controlled traffic farming, harvest stubble, where they've driven about all over the place with 30-ton machines. So now they have to go in and rip that up with cultivators to get the compaction out. That's our system, where 80% of the field's never been trafficked. So it means I can direct drill that, just plant the seeds into it, or just do a light scratch. So I'm trying to get close to the nature system of not cultivating. So I'm leaving the retained carbon in the soil, and I'm not disturbing my earthworms, slots and different things. That's what it looks like in practice. The different machines, they're all driving on the 10-metre lanes. Right, stop for a sec. The next section is really quick because it's just loads of pretty pictures about the farm. I'll just stop sharing for a sec. How are we doing for time, Sarah? Am I overrunning or?
So it is 8 o'clock, and I have to admit, I'm originally advertised this talk as an hour long. I did sneak it up in Eventbrite to an hour and a half. If people do have to leave, please don't feel that that's rude. You know, just drop out quietly. That's fine, and we will be hopefully the recording will work, and we will share that afterwards anyway.
There's no technical stuff in the next bit. It's all just pretty pictures.
So you've still got half an hour on our new timings for remaining talk and questions. So I think we've got time for some questions now. So a question that came in a while ago, James asks, which countries, if any, don't have such a horrendous mix of agri-food problems? Is anyone doing this better already?
I don't know. You imagine some of the less developed countries. I don't know. I wouldn't be expert enough to comment really, but I did say at the start, I'm having to use sweeping generalizations to paint a broad picture of mainstream ag. There's obviously super enlightened people like Lucy's sister that have been on the case for years. But there's other people I'm as guilty as everybody has been sold the industrial ag dream, but I've sort of seen the light now, and I feel like I'm a recovering addict. I go to my AA meetings, and so I am speaking in great generalizations. Even in the UK, there's people farming properly, and there's farming systems that are operating nicely. But I'm talking about the mainstream ag.
Yeah, but I mean, absolutely. I'm sure we all recognise that supermarket picture as being our mainstream food system at the moment. That's our main food supplier, really, aren't they, at the moment? This question sort of follows on a bit from this. A lot of this must come down to the consumer, and the question must be how to change consumer behaviour. And Chris and Mary, any thoughts on that?
Education, really. Education is the change is driven by three things all working together. I always think regulatory, carrots and sticks, and education, all three working together. A carbon tax would work quite nicely as a regulatory stick, because it would obviously make kiwi fruits quite expensive, and it would make apples produced at grow farms relatively cheaper. A carbon tax would be good. Education, support for more government support for smaller scale horticultural enterprises, rather than at the moment. This is all changing to a point anyway, but you're still in the situation where the smaller businesses are getting the least amount of subsidization, and the big people, I can't really name names, but the big agribusinesses that we all have heard about in the press that get the bulk of the subsidies, compared with nice little funky horticultural enterprises producing local food that aren't really getting any government help at all, and consumer education. And I think COVID is helping a bit, because people are realizing the need to be healthy, and people are realizing the problems with obesity and health with COVID, and this highly processed food that's full of sugar. And it's just, I think the message is getting out there.
So we've got quite a few questions here. So I might have to be a bit selective at the moment, and then people can ask them again at the end if they feel they still haven't been covered by the talk. How common is this type of farming, and where did you learn about it? Are other UK, do you know what kind of proportion of other UK farmers might be taking the same sort of approach as you?
Hang on, you mean my old-fashioned farming or my regenerative agriculture?
You're enlightened, you're light farming.
Yeah, no. The buzzword seems to be regenerative agriculture, and which in theory, takes it above sustainability. Sustainability is just sustaining what's there at the moment, whereas regenerative agriculture tries to actually improve the situation, particularly from the biodiversity and the nature and soil health point of view. It's gaining momentum, but it still needs to gain momentum more quickly. It is gaining momentum. It's gaining momentum from the ground up rather than the top down. I think DEFRA and the universities and the scientists are behind the old-fashioned pyramid. When I was at college, the scientists and the universities told us how to farm, and the knowledge got filtered downwards from government-funded bodies like ADAS, which was the old version of DEFRA. And now I think this regenerative agriculture is starting from the ground up, and it's almost pushing up at DEFRA and the universities and the scientists to saying, this is what we're doing. Justify it with science. It works on the ground. Yeah, it's gathering momentum, but it needs to gather momentum even more quickly.
Thank you. And how's your change in farming? How's it affected yields and profitability? And does it make food more expensive for people?
Yeah, well, the problem is with food is our share of the food pot. I didn't talk about the supply chain very much because I didn't have time, but we're right down at the bottom of the supply chain, and we make a tiny little profit, and then all the processors up the chain do loads of things to the food, and eventually turns up on the supermarket shelf like that horrendous picture, and everyone's made a big profit along the way. So what we do doesn't actually change the value of our food to the next person on the step very much anyway. So it's quite difficult because we're not taking the food. We need to be able to take the whole take it all the way along the food chain. If I had a farm shop up at the top buildings and I could knock out all the middlemen steps, I could maybe get more for my food, and I could market it and say, but we're not producing the right type of food because we're still producing wheat that's competing with the Ukraine and Australia and America and Argentina, rather than food that you can go and buy in a shop like you can from a horticultural enterprise. I've forgotten what the question was now.
And the other bit of the question was how it's affected your yields and profitability.
Our yields are more robust because if you think about it, industrial agriculture worked when we had, industrial agriculture was fantastic when we had a nice climate, which was always the same in the UK. The sun always shone. We always got the rain at the right time, and we never got droughts or floods. And so it was all hunky-dory. We just like I say, we just stood the crop up in the soil and pile the inputs on. But if you start to get droughts, wet events and things like that, if you've got a healthy soil system, in particular, like I say, in the wet events, the soil drains through better. In the drought events, the soil, because it's got more carbon, the carbon's like a sponge, it holds moisture. So we've had dry springs for 3 springs on the trot now, and our yields haven't been as impacted as badly as other people in my benchmarking group. There's a group of about 12 farmers, and I see our yields are much more constant rather than follow a roller coaster. It's hard to say about profitability because there's so many variables, because at the end of the day, the season itself decides the yield of your crops. And so if you have a really good growing season and you've got really high yields, you'll be really profitable. But unless you have half your farm farming in one system and half the farm farming in the other as a controlled experiment, it's hard to know what's made the difference. It's time and gut feel at the end of the day. You just get a feel over time. It just feels better, and it feels more robust, and it feels more harmonious, and it's more interesting because industrial agriculture was too simple. This is more interesting because it's more complex. We need to race on, really.
Yes. So I have one more question because it related particularly to a picture in the slides, which was, do you use Ndvi to determine crop growth at all? And I'd like to add to that, I don't know what Ndvi is.
Yeah, we use that. I'll whiz through that at the end. I've got loads of slides that I'm not going to show, but I'll just whiz through it for about 10 seconds. That's satellite imagery of the crop biomass, so that you can use the crop biomass to vary how many inputs you put on where. I'll talk about that just for about 10 seconds when I get to it.
All right, lovely. All right, we'll let you carry on then. Thanks very much.
Okay. Sorry, I'm going to have to really whiz through this now. what are we going to do? Hang on. Oh, that's good. Yeah, it's all about biodiversity and complexity. So industrial agriculture basically creates prairies, like on the right there, because it's easy to manage, and you grow a big field of wheat, and if it gets a disease, you pick up a phone to the chemical company and get a chemical to kill the disease, and you go back into your office and job's done. But we've already said that model's broken. So what we're wanting, and also we've realized that biodiversity and complexity, as I said at the start, you can't not damage nature, but you need to get as close to nature as you can, which is keeping the biodiversity there to keep as many species for species. This is where we start to talk about species for species. And also, if these chemicals are too polluting, particularly think about insecticides is a good example, they're polluting. And also, as I said, everything's resistant to the insecticides now, so they don't work anymore. So why would you use them? So maybe we can use beneficial insects to help us, like farms used to in the old days. You might have seen around farms over the last few years, you know, these token wildflower strips around the edge of fields. They're fantastic. It's a habitat for beneficials and it looks nice and it's hunky-dory. But actually, if you've got a great big prairie with a strip of wildflowers around the edge there, can that actually stop you using insecticides? If you've got a load of ladybirds there and you've got aphids in your crop, the ladybirds will only go about 50 meters into the crop. So you still have to end up spraying an insecticide in the middle of the field. So why not, this is an aerial view of one of our fields, see those light green strips, why not put these wildflower strip habitats down the middle of the fields? They're 90 meters apart. So any ladybird or carabid beetle or anything has only got to go about 45 meters out to be able to cover the whole field. And so, hey, hang on a minute, can we get beneficials? That's what they look like in the early spring. Can we get these beneficials to actually do a job for us? And we don't have to use insecticides. The answer is probably yes. Yeah, the nice big mammals. Interestingly, the knock-on effect from having these strips, this particular field, we get way more deer damage in the crops. At harvest time, usually there's loads of big areas of flattened crops where the deers have flattened it, but the deer much prefer living in and eating these diverse wildflower strips than living in my monocultures. So I sometimes see whole lines of the deer just grazing and lying in these strips. So we get less crop damage as well. I don't know where all these arrows are coming from. This is just to show how the biodiversity changes when you put a bit of biodiversity in the field. So that's a sticky trap I put in the middle of a wheat field. And there's a lot of stuff there. I'm not an entomologist, so I can't really talk in detail about this. There's a lot of stuff there and it's covered in little insects, but they're all pretty well the same. You can't really see it on the photo, but if you looked at it in real life, there's not much biodiversity there. But then I put a sticky trap close to the wildflower strips, and the amount of biodiversity compared to the other sticky trap was shocking. All the different coloured insects, different sizes. There is much more biodiversity in these biodiverse areas. Okay, quickly whizzing through these slides now. Again, there's a few things here on these slides. It's all about limiting N use, which I was talking about before, sucking N out the atmosphere instead of putting on with artificial N, and also improving the infield diversity. So I'm trying to recreate the Brazilian rainforest in my fields. So instead of the situation you got in the Irish potato blight, where you've got a single species and it gets wiped out once these sprays don't work anymore, we've got biodiversity, so pests and diseases can't really take hold. So we've got burr-seam clover with our oilseed rape. We've got spring barley with a clover understory. Both of those are legumes, so they're helping feed nitrogen to the crop. We've got spring oats direct drilled into established winter beans. That didn't work very well because it's difficult to harvest and separate. We've got spring oats and spring beans intercropping there. So we're experimenting with a lot of things that you won't really notice walking around the estate, but this intercropping and improving the infield diversity is one of the things, but it's very difficult. It's very difficult to harvest and it's very difficult to separate the crops. Agroforestry is one of my big things that we haven't really got into yet, but that's the ultimate infield diversity. So you've got these nice beneficial strips, but hey presto, you make them even more beneficial by putting a line of trees in. And if you think about it, think about all the things I was talking about, photosynthesis. You've got three-dimensional photosynthesis. You're capturing more sunshine. You look where those tree roots are under the roots of the annual crop. So the water and nutrients that leach under the annual crop roots, the trees harvest, and then that goes up into their leaves. Then the leaves fall on the surface and you're recycling nutrients. Remember that nitrate leaching that would have been going down into the water systems. you're recycling nutrients, thinking about spaces for species, you're increasing the habitats within fields, you've got all these three-dimensional trees growing. That's really the ultimate in-field biodiversity. Here's where it might go in the future, because it's hard to do, but with the advent of robots and all these big farm machineries I was talking about might disappear. We might have little swarms of little robots doing the work because we've got no men on them. And if we can have swarms of little robots, we can have the biodiversity in little strips down the fields because we haven't got the big machinery, and we can harvest it separately, and we can dry it and store it separately and spray it separately. So really, I see that as the future for in-field diversity. Effectively, you're making lots of little strip fields within a field. We're even doing it with the sheep. I don't know what's happened to this. I don't know why I've got that funny little square. Never mind. That text says, happy you with lambs, but diet is single species ryegrass fertilized with synthetic nitrogen. So again, it's single species. It's not great. Whereas now we're moving towards multi-species herbal lays on the left. We don't put any nitrogen on those because they've got a lot of legumes in there. And I've already spoke about multi-species cover crops. So interestingly, as well as the soil ecology being happier because it's got a diversity of root systems and interactions, the sheep, it's like that sheep up on the top left there, it's fantastic, but it's like you eating chips every day for 365 days a year instead of a nice 5 a day mixed diet. These sheep have got a much nicer, more natural mixed diet, and they're happier and healthier for it. You don't have to worm them so often, because some of the things like the chicory in these herbal lays, they're natural anthelmintics, and so it's all good. Okay, biodiversity in our windbreaks, nearly done. 5 minutes less. Biodiversity in our windbreaks, these mainly Western red cedar and Corsican pine windbreaks. As they become mature, we're gradually starting to turn those over to more diverse range of mainly broadleaf species. We've started on some of these. You'll have seen some of the south sides have been taken off. We need to obviously do it gradually so we don't lose the whole habitat and the whole visual thing in the environment. So the idea is to take the south side off, and when that's grown up a bit, we can then take the north side off and replant that. So we've got oaks and Italian alders and beeches and cherries and lots of different things going in there. So that's, again, creating better spaces for species and more biodiversity. We're even creating, there's some deer on my wildflower strips. Space for people as well. We're not forgetting people. Our footpaths, you'll notice we're doing quite a few things with our footpaths, and the top two are showing, the top left and the top right are showing where we're going with a lot of our paths to make it nicer for everybody and provide spaces for species. That top left is the diagonal path. If you go up by the shop and you head towards Rosistock, where you've got the sort of 5-year-old hedge on the right, you've got the bridle path, and on the left I've planted a 6-metre wildflower strip. So you've sort of got habitats both sides of the footpath. And what it also means is that when we're spraying, that people on the footpath are more away from any harmful spray drift because it's been a bit further removed from the footpath. The important thing, and this other one here, we've planted a new hedge down the left-hand side with an environmental payment. That's the footpath from Oldfield Farm going down towards Harwell. There's a new hedge just gone in the last few weeks. And again, there's a wildflower strip on the right-hand side. So it's basically providing space for wildlife that wasn't there before. It's making the footpaths nicer for people walking around the estate. And we'll also continue, we take our footpaths quite seriously. I don't have to, but I mow the footpaths at our own cost to try and make them nice to walk on. The county council don't do it, and we're not obliged to do it, but we do it. The main thing is to respect these footpaths and not amble all over these nice new wildflower strips. That's another, down in the bottom left, that's another hedge where we're breaking up the big prairie landscape. So hopefully there'll be an improvement in the landscape aesthetic value as well. That's down by the Harwell site, looking back towards the deer park, where there's 2 big prairies there. We've separated those with a hedge now. That slide on the right is the road down to Oldfield. We're just about to gap up that hedge. So I've been there with my chainsaw and cut down all the bits that are in the way, and we're gapping up that hedge. That's a few years ago when I redid the bridle path down the back of Harwell at our own cost again. Nobody asked us to do that. We cultivated that and reseeded it and made that nice for everybody. So we're committed to letting everybody have a nice time walking around all our footpaths and bridleways. Very quick one on shoot. Literally, I'm virtually done. Shooting, good or bad. 2 points to make here. Look at the habitats that allows us to have for other things as well. So we've got the maize in on the left there, and we've got wild bird cover here. So that's habitats for the pheasants, but it's also habitats for other wildlife. And so you've got a fantastic classic scenario here. If you look at this field, you've got the woodland habitat on the left. You've then got the maize habitat. You've then got the wild bird habitat there. Next to that, then you've got a 6-metre wildflower strip, and then you've got the crop. So we've got a range of habitats covering lots of species, lots of beneficials. Shooting, good or bad. Going back to the broken food system. So everybody's perpetuating, by going into Tesco's and buying your £5 chicken, you're perpetuating that intensively farmed chicken, which is climate unfriendly, antibiotic unfriendly, blah, 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 blah. And these pheasants are wandering around on the estate, and they're shot and they're free on the rack outside Hendred House. It's free meat. It's got no carbon footprint hardly, and it's welfare friendly. I'm just making the point that, you know, the food system is what it is, but there's other ways of eating things and getting food. Measuring greenhouse gas fluxes on Hendred Estate. These are just things that you might have seen. We're involved in the science as well. These are machines to measure the greenhouse gas flows in and out. We do quite a lot of work with the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. These things are sort of scattered around the estate. Carbon footprint I'll spend about 5 seconds on that. That's our carbon footprint. The greenhouse gas emissions out are the blue bars, and the sequestration is the green bars. The big blue bar is basically nitrogen fertilizer, and the big green bar is basically soil organic matter, carbon into soil. The other big green bar is carbon being soaked up by woodland. 2 seconds on the Ndvi maps. I'm not going to talk about this, but variable rate revolution. This is all about using scarce, environmentally unfriendly resources more efficiently. And this is all about NDVIs. And let me just get a picture. There's an NDVI image on the left. That's a growing crop of wheat in the field behind Harwell. And on the right there, we've done a variable rate nitrogen application map. So we're not wasting synthetic nitrogen fertilizer on bits of crop that aren't going to yield very much. We're targeting it. That's the machine we use to do it. The future in payments, we talked about this. We don't need to do this. One more slide and I'm done. Yeah, it's all changing. Direct subsidy payments reducing over the next 7 years to nothing. New environmental payments. It's all about public money for public goods. UK Ag's aiming for net zero carbon emissions by 2040. I'm pretty well there now, I think, although these carbon footprints are, you can't take them too literally, the exact numbers on them. They're best used as a tool to do it every year and see if you're getting better or worse, because it depends how far back you take the carbon footprint. Like all of these things, it's more nuanced than it appears. That's very simplistic. But I think we're there, personally. I think I'm there. And then the big one at the bottom is the potential to attract private capital through biodiversity net gain schemes and selling carbon offsets. That's the big thing that's coming. I'm done. Sustainable food and farming, it's basically requires systems thinking and complexity and diversity of land use rather than simplified approaches. I did have a big slide in for the girls to leave at the end, but then I thought I better not put that in, but I have put a little female hand there, sustainable food and farming, holding a picture of a plant. And sometimes in my more gender sympathetic moments, I think that the big problem with UK agriculture is it's run by blokes because we like simple systems and we can't keep all the balls up in the air at once. And if UK agriculture had been run by women for the past 40 years, we might have these sustainable, complex systems operating quite effectively. Sorry, guys, I'll get shot. Yeah, that's me done. Yeah, hang on.
All right, thank you so much, Julian. I've got a couple more questions in already, and I'm sure there'll be more. So, any thoughts on why some farmers are still cutting down all their hedges?
Not, I don't think. I'm not really aware. It's illegal to take down hedges without doing an environmental impact assessment. It's virtually impossible to take hedges out now.
I didn't know that. That's that seems like progress. Comment that there is high antibiotic usage in the game sector, higher per kilogram than in other livestock.
Yes, I'd agree. That's all about.
Got any questions that they would actually like to ask back in the meeting now? So you can use a raise hand function, which you should find in participants, I think. Can anyone remember where raise hand is? Or you can sort of wave at me or put something in the chat. So
sorry, quickly, Sarah. Will the Zoom call suddenly die at 8:30? No,
it won't. But I haven't actually had my tea yet, so I would quite.
So I didn't know if it's suddenly all going to go black.
No, it won't. No, it won't actually do that to us.
While someone's thinking of a question, can I just answer the pheasant thing? The pheasant thing is the same as everything else. It's all about the intensity. These it's like my intensive livestock. You can have intensive shoots, and rearing too many pheasants in too small an area, it's the same as any other intensive livestock unit. It's all about scale and making it more extensive. It's just as bad. An intensive shoot is just as bad as an intensive chicken unit.
So I haven't found raise hand.
Graham's got a raised hand.
Go for it, Graham.
Can I make a comment on driving this forward, in the sense that you will have to influence the likes of Valcourt, Dyson, and they are being influenced, there's no doubt about it. And cost is one of the things which will influence it. And people are looking at just what you've looked at, Julian, in terms of the cost of the operation, by just direct drilling, by taking some of those other costs out. And so costs will have a huge effect in trying, and also the way the subsidy is then directed, because otherwise farming will go the other way on an American scale. If they're going, we produce a commodity and the commodity is just going up and down. Wheat is now hit £200 a tonne. 6 months ago, it was £140 a tonne. So those are the things that will drive certain parts of it. My comment's over.
Yeah, I think that the likes of Valcourt and everybody and all farmers are going to get driven by elms, the new elms payments anyway. The elms payments haven't been they haven't been properly privatised yet. They're just in draft form, but there's 3 levels of elms, and the higher levels of elms pay farmers quite a lot of money to do quite a lot of environmental stuff, particularly on a landscape scale as well, joining together with other farms to produce. I talked about land sparing and land sharing, and do you have pockets of wildlife and pockets of intensive farming? In the big payments, in the new environmental payments from DEFRA, farmers that join together and do projects that sort of are a landscape scale, nature recovery sort of projects, they'll get more money.
So that's a bit like us trying to pool our collective resources in the Hendreds, in our space for wildlife, that if we can act in a coordinated way, we can have a much bigger impact. Anyone else trying to wave at me, do unmute yourself and say, hey, if I haven't seen you.
Hi.
Wave.
Julian, Keith here. Can you hear us?
Go ahead.
Yeah, did you have I put a question in the chat, but I saw the government policy coming out around a sustainable path to farming. I don't know if you've had a chance to have a look at that and whether or not you think that's a positive contribution to this overall debate.
I haven't seen that particular document because there's a lot of woolly government documents been coming out over the last few months about the new environmental payments. But yeah, no, it will be. It's on the right. It's on the right lines, but it's complicated. Anything bureaucratic is quite complicated coming out of DEFRA because there's rules and regulations and auditing and everything else to do. It would be easier not to need the carrots and sticks from DEFRA, and if food was just more expensive and consumers wanted to pay loads of money to have food produced in a more environmentally friendly way, rather than buy the £5 chicken.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. My reading of it, Julian, was that it was trying to anticipate the move towards more intensive, if I could sort of try and frame it in simple terms, a more intensive way of farming. So including things like multi-story, intensive agriculture units, those sorts of things that you've seen in the press, and using that as a way of creating more space for wildlife and greater opportunity for biodiversity. I mean, in really simple terms, it seems to me that it looked like a bit of a move from government's point of view, from support for European agricultural policy into something quite different.
Yeah, no, that's good if they're going to start pushing that uber intensive systems as well, because like I said earlier, and like you just said, it creates more space if you can intensify it, and also it's a climate adaptation strategy as well. I mean, everybody talks about climate mitigation, but we also have to have climate adaptation strategies where you acknowledge that the climate's changing, and we might be living in a desert in 50 years time in the UK, but if we've got hydroponic units and vertical farming with LED lights and things, we can still survive.
A couple more questions that I've seen in the chat. Are you inclined to go into forestry in any degree?
Yeah, but it's almost sacrilege we're on such good quality land. Again, it's all about, it's what you use the land for. We're on such good quality land here. It's almost sacrilege to plant too many trees on it in a big scale. But the thing that I would be really into is agroforestry, where you're mixing it together. The thing with agroforestry that's really good is it's additional trees. It's not very many trees per hectare because they're at a low density. But if you think about where trees are planted, they're planted around the edges of fields, and they're planted in traditional poor soil areas like on tops of hills in Scotland and Wales. And so you're always going to get trees planted in those areas. But agroforestry allows you to have additional trees on good farmland. So even though there's not many of them, they're extra.
Thanks. And one final question, I think we'll make this the last one. Are the Archers or Countryfile and such programs, are they helpful or are they a hindrance?
I don't know. I can't really answer that. I used to listen to the Archers, but I don't tend to now. And after being on Countryfile about 3 times, I've stopped watching it because when you can see that for serious debate, Countryfile, I don't think, I've got to be careful what I say, but for serious debate, I don't think Countryfile's any use really, because they've filmed with me and they filmed for like 6 or 7 hours and then had about 40 seconds of footage, and it's all taken out of context and you've got no editorial control over it. And so when I see things on Countryfile and I see little snippets from farmers, I think, oh, I wonder how many hours of filming that was and how out of context it is. It's very, very difficult because it's a program that's catering to the masses on a Sunday night, and it can't really be taken as a scientific treatise on where agriculture is going and where it should be going.
Yeah, so it's a bit of a magazine, really, isn't it? So I guess it does enable us to exercise our interest in it, but it's not going deep. Well, that was absolutely brilliant. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the chat, but you really should, because you're getting loads of thanks for an excellent talk in there. Thank you very much for your time this evening and for that detailed call. Yeah.
Thank you, Julian.
And thank you all very much for joining us. So this talk was actually oversubscribed in the end, because we do actually have quite a small, cheap Zoom account that we have access to, which does limit our numbers. So I apologise for that. Hopefully the recording has worked, and so we'll be able to share that with people who couldn't make it in the end. Our next webinar is on Wednesday, I think it's the 3rd of February, but certainly the first Wednesday in February, again at 7 p.m. And that will be somebody speaking to us from Naturehood. And Naturehood is a project that's specifically been set up to help communities work together to support wildlife in their communities. So they're really sort of doing and helping and guiding communities do exactly what we want to do, with a particular focus on some key species, including hedgehogs, which I know are already a key interest area, because the cubs have already done a lot of work to help hedgehogs in the area. So please do join us for that if you can. It's the same link for Eventbrite. We'll put all our events on that Eventbrite page, because we'll be looking to book up. And of course, we'll be looking for practical advice and activities for people to get involved in, as Sean described at the beginning, and how we're looking at actually managing the space around us for wildlife. So thank you all very much for joining us. And yeah, good night and stay safe.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Yeah, do.
Will the chat box stay there? Because if I look at the questions and if I answer any that want answering, will they still be there for people to look at, or do they disappear forever in a sec?
They probably do disappear forever. So what I'll do is I'll cut and paste them and email them to you.
Oh yeah.
Is that all right?
Yeah. Okay. I haven't seen any of the questions in the text. I've only just popped it up now. Okay.
Yeah, I'll cut and paste it and I'll email it to you, because I think actually the chat will disappear. Probably.
All right.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Good night.
Bye.
All right.
Thanks, Julian. Brilliant.